Way back in 1987, Taito released an arcade game called Rastan, or Rastan if you prefer, an action platformer that took heavy inspiration from Conan the Barbarian. It basically told a story about how Rastan defeats many evildoers and ascends to the throne. Rastan first showed up for me at the Fun and Games arcade at Charlottesville's Fashion Square Mall. I was blown away by the visuals, which of course meant I needed to drop a credit in and give it a go. I was met with one heck of a fun adventure. Rastan had different weapons to use. He could attack above and below. He could swing and climb ropes. He had to avoid traps and face some pretty aggressive enemies. It was a standout title among the 1987 pack, and I played it as much as I could whenever I found it. Eventually, I would discover the Sega Master System port in 1989. The visuals and sound took a hit, but the gameplay was quite well done. It would see numerous ports to home computers as well, but back then I only ever saw the Master System edition, and it was good enough. Imagine my interest when I discovered that Taito had created a direct sequel called Rastan Saga 2, and was releasing it for the Sega Genesis in 1991. Man, I was so incredibly excited to play it, and in this episode, we will go over what I thought of it and how it turned out. This one is painful, so let's get it over with. Like the original Rastan, Part 2 is a tale about the main hero's younger days before he became king. A band of demons known as the Wicked Group intend to steal the Stone of the Wise and take it to the top of the Great Skyscraper, giving them absolute dominion over the earth. The human population cowers in fear as monsters wreak havoc, but Rastan rises to the challenge to stop their advance. The game is a pretty standard side-scrolling action platformer from there. You start with a basic sword and shield, and like the first, you can attack above and below you. When not attacking, Rastan has a default blocking stance with his shield, though you must be facing the enemy in the proper direction to avoid the attack. If the enemy is above you, you must be pressing up. Below you, you must be pressing down, so on and so forth. Your sword and shield aren't your only options, however. You can also get a great sword that is much longer with a greater reach, and you can get a pair of claws that attack extremely fast. From there are a few different power-ups to add to your offensive capabilities. The Flame Crest adds fire to your attacks, the Lightning Crest adds electrical damage that can't be blocked, you can get a set of fangs that orbit you and do damage, there's a crest that destroys all the enemies on the screen as well. Other items in the field include life replacement, a damage-reducing cloak, and extra lives. After you defeat the boss of a level, you get a stone that upgrades your damage output. The stages themselves are very simple in overall design. There are obstacles to contend with, but it's rarely more than some light jumping or rope swinging required to negotiate them. Environments range from mountains, forests, and caves, 5 in total, each with 2 parts and a boss encounter. Some enemies have the block capability the same as you, so the proper weapon and attack can make all the difference. Your life is a 10-block bar at the bottom left of the screen. In true arcade form, a timer drives the action, and you lose a life if it runs out. You're gonna want to watch those lives because you have limited continues. Finally, the arcade original sported 2-player co-op, while the Genesis port is for 1 player only. The visuals here are a nasty combination of bad artistic choices and technical letdowns. It's tough to believe that Rastan Saga 2 was an arcade game that looked like this in 1988, and the same holds true as a 16-bit Genesis game in 1991. Take a look at the main hero sprite. Completely absent is the cool Conan the Barbarian vibe of the original, replaced by a guy that looks like he should be little more than a foot soldier in a much better game. The backgrounds are equally disappointing, lacking any real outstanding detail, and missing the many layers that define Genesis games of the day. About the only thing this game has going for it graphically are the large sprites, but even that has a flaw in that they are all animated terribly. Because of the small 4 megabit ROM size, you rarely get more than a few frames per enemy, with even the bosses lacking any mobility or flexibility in their attacks. Most of your foes will move about slowly, flick out a 2-frame attack, and that's all the eye candy you get in this one. The art design also fails beyond the main hero. Each stage seems to be made up of square blocks, which means there is a sameness to the entire journey. Some of these blocks can be destroyed and some of them are different colors, but at the end of the day you are still seeing a familiar pattern that lasts the entire way. Since the background detail is subpar and there are few layers of parallax scrolling, nothing back there stands out or is memorable. As I mentioned earlier, the arcade had pretty much the same issues, so none of this is specific to this version of the game. In fact, the Genesis port looks very similar to the arcade, so in that regard, the developers at Opera House did the job they were paid to do. Rastan Saga 2 was never a good-looking adventure, however. It just happens to suffer a bit more by 1991 standards. The sound in the first game was downright iconic. It even sounded fantastic on the Master System when it came home. The arcade Saga 2 didn't sound so bad itself, but in this home port, the Genesis does a substandard job with the sound and music. Nothing here stands out, there isn't much of it, and all the arcade speech has been removed. Again, this is likely strangled by the 4 megabit cart size. There are but a handful of tunes that stay on repeat the entire way, and there was no room for speech of any kind. By 1991, we had heard some impressive audio from the Genesis, so this was a letdown on every level. Here are a couple examples so you can get a feel for the soundtrack. Beyond my critique for the audio and visual side of things, there is so much I disliked about this game it's hard to focus my thoughts. It's incredibly short and can be beaten in 20 minutes once you know the enemy and trap patterns. It would have been one thing had those 20 minutes been a roller coaster ride like Capcom's Strider, but this feels far more pedestrian and lacking any excitement at all. There's no great set pieces to traverse. No obstacle that defines the area you are playing. You simply walk and jump to the right, never facing anything more than the same enemies across levels that have no meaningful distinction at all. To be more blunt, this is straight up boring as hell. Perhaps you think the variety of weapons and power-ups may help, but they have a random or hidden quality that means you can play the entire game and barely see any of them. I played through twice for this capture here, and never saw the fire crest or fangs a single time. This stands in stark contrast to the arcade version, which throws the different weapons and power-ups at you constantly. That may leave you wondering if there's anything here worth a look. It does have the block mechanic that works most of the time, and the later stages can be a bit of a challenge until you learn the enemy placement. But I can't honestly recommend this one based on so little. Saga 2 is a funky-looking, average-sounding bore-fest of a sequel that doesn't deserve the namesake of its predecessor. I would have rather have had an accurate port of the first arcade game on the Genesis than this mess. The one area that could have really added some much-needed appeal was the arcade's 2-player co-op mode, but in typical style, it's been removed entirely, leaving little reason to seek this one out. I wouldn't go so far as to call Rastan Saga 2 irredeemably awful. It's just a big letdown compared to the original game and should have been so much better. Taito was capable of some incredible game design, and it really makes you wonder why this project went so wrong. The Genesis wasn't the only home console to get a port of this. The PC Engine received one as well, which again is surprisingly close to the arcade in terms of visuals. You get the large sprites and the stage design is fairly faithful. The PC Engine game even manages to sound like the arcade a bit more than the Genesis. Beyond that, it's the same story. A boring game that lacks the arcade original's 2-player mode. And that's it. That's our legacy for this sequel. A so-so arcade game with 2 so-so home ports that all fail to live up to the appeal of the first game. This game needed a larger ROM size, smaller sprites to preserve the 2-player mode, and additional content and more stages, enemies, and items. This was 1991 and the 16-bit landscape was changing in a major way. Video games are getting longer, deeper, with much more to see and do in the way of secrets and hidden content. Simple arcade ports of super short titles didn't cut it anymore, something Sega itself had tried to contend with by making games like eSWAT, City Under Siege, and The Revenge of Shinobi entirely new experiences. If you did have a pure arcade game like this to bring home, you had better have a good one, and unfortunately, Saga 2 fails to deliver the goods. This wasn't helped by the fact that also in 1991, Taito released another game in the series called Warrior Blade Rastan Saga Episode 3, a multi-screen side-scrolling beat-em-up in the vein of Golden Axe. That was so much better than Saga 2, and would have been much more appreciated on the Genesis in my opinion, especially had they managed to keep the multiplayer. Alas, this is all we received back then. A disappointing port of a disappointing arcade sequel. With nothing to draw inspiration from, the Genesis version was doomed before it was ever released. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.